Energy and Mineral Resources will come to order. Good morning and welcome to the subcommittee. We're meeting today to hear testimony on what more public lands, oil and gas leasing means for achieving U.S. climate targets. Under Committee Rule 4F, any oral opening statements at hearings are limited to the chair and the ranking minority member or their designees. This will allow us to hear from our witnesses sooner and help members keep to their schedules. Therefore, I ask unanimous consent that all other members' opening statements be made part of the hearing record if they are submitted to the clerk by 5 p.m. today or at the close of the hearing, whichever comes first. Hearing no objection, so ordered. Without objection, the chair may also declare a recess subject to the call of the chair. Without objection, the member from New Mexico, Representative Stansbury, is authorized to question the witnesses in today's hearing. As described in the notice, statements, documents, or motions must be submitted to the electronic repository at hnrcdocs@mail.house.gov. Additionally, please note that as with in-person meetings, members are responsible for their own microphones. As with our in-person meetings, members can be muted by staff only to avoid inadvertent background noise. Finally, members or witnesses experiencing technical problems should inform committee staff members immediately. With that, I will begin with my opening statement. Just about 3 years ago, the Department of the Interior released a groundbreaking report that found fossil fuels produced from America's public lands and its waters are responsible for nearly a quarter of the U.S. greenhouse gas emissions each year. And last week, the Department of the Interior released its much anticipated report on the federal oil and gas leasing program. Last week's report has been the focus of significant speculation since the Interior Department began its review in January and at the direction of one of President Biden's climate change executive orders. The report recommended a number of necessary reforms, including increasing royalty and rental rates, minimum bid amounts, stronger bonding standards, and the new bidding requirements. These changes are long overdue. But a glaring omission from the report was any discussion on the emissions that result from oil and gas drilling on public lands. In my view, this was a missed opportunity, and it's a critical issue that we must address. America's public lands contain massive fossil fuel reserves, and Interior's leasing practices and its management of these resources are incredibly outdated and destructive. In 2020, oil and gas drilling on public lands generated nearly 10%. They generated nearly 10% of all U.S. energy-related emissions. This carbon pollution fuels the climate crisis and causes more frequent heat waves, stronger storms, reduced snowpack, shifting wildlife habitat, and other disastrous impacts. Not to mention the effects oil and gas extraction has on local air and water quality, and communities that are forced to deal with economic boom and bust cycles. The stakes of reducing U.S. greenhouse gas emissions are incredibly high, and failure to act will have catastrophic results and consequences for our nation's health and its well-being. That's why last month, during COP26, the U.S. committed to a 50 to 52% reduction of emissions below 2005 levels by 2030, that is the end of this decade, and a net zero economy no later than 2050. The Biden administration has staked America's global reputation on achieving these aggressive climate goals, and it will take a whole of government approach if we are to succeed. Leadership from the Interior Department is necessary now more than ever before, and America's public lands must play a central role in the Biden administration's climate strategy. If the U.S. is going to deliver on its commitment, hard decisions need to be made and they need to be carried out. That's why those of us concerned with the direction of U.S. emissions were thrilled when the Interior Department paused new leasing earlier this year while conducting its review. There are nearly 100,000 oil and gas wells spread across over 26 million acres of public land leases. And for years, the fossil fuel industry has taken advantage of bargain basement royalties and fees and leasing and permitting decisions that have never accounted for climate change. All of this has made a pause and review of the leasing program essential and a critical first step in aligning the management of public lands with the administration's climate change goals. But a deeply flawed June ruling has required the Interior Department to move forward with some amount of new leasing. The Bureau of Ocean Energy Management, BOEM, held an offshore lease sale several weeks ago, and the Bureau of Land Management, BLM, plans to hold lease sales across multiple states early next year. In late October, BLM released a report analyzing past and future emissions from drilling and found that emissions from leases issued over the next year could annually emit the same amount as 37 coal-fired power plants, furthering the amount of warming, local air pollution, and risks to groundwater, and deepening our dependence on oil and gas extraction. Quantifying future emissions is good, but we need actions that reduce or prevent them in the first place. Simply relying on minor reforms to the edges of the leasing program can't be considered a success if it doesn't put the U.S. on a path towards achieving its climate commitments. The Department of Interior needs to develop a comprehensive approach to managing and reducing emissions from public lands. Fortunately, it already possesses the necessary authorities and expertise to get it done. And if the United States is going to confront the threat of climate change, the administration must do. With that, I look forward to the testimony from our witnesses, and I now recognize Ranking Member Stauber for his opening statements. Welcome, Representative Stauber.
Thank you very much, Chairman Lowenthal. It's great to be with you today, as always. And thanks to the witnesses for joining us today. You know, Democrats chose to title today's hearing, in quotations, "What More Public Lands Leasing Means for Achieving U.S. Climate Targets," end quote. I want to note that Democrats chose to focus on domestic emissions and not global emissions in their hearing title, and decided to hold this hearing on the heels of their Friday after Thanksgiving news dump of a report from the administration. Why? Well, because they refuse to acknowledge the truth that no matter how much they demonize domestic oil and gas production, America is not the problem. Between 2005 and 2020, the United States decreased its CO2 emissions by 24%, while global emissions grew by 14%. Meanwhile, domestic oil production on federal lands and waters hit an all-time high at 1 billion barrels in 2019, thanks to the advent of fracking and the leadership of President Trump. That's right, everybody. We produced more oil and natural gas than ever before and simultaneously led the world in emissions reductions. This little fact here is incredibly inconvenient to the Democratic Party narrative. Therefore, we need to hold hearings like this so Democrats can parrot the keep it in the ground mentality that their base and this administration supports, while receiving congratulations from their high-dollar activist cocktail parties or rubbing elbows with the communist country of China, and while they were in Glasgow. So Republicans are going to simply continue to focus on the facts. For starters, China has emitted 23 times more than the United States and Europe combined since 2005. Or how about Russia, the second largest supplier of oil to the United States under the Biden administration? They emitted the most methane in the world at 12.9 million tons. Or how about Saudi Aramco? The Saudis have emitted more than 40 billion metric tons of greenhouse gases between 1992 and 2017. And when faced with these realities, what did the Biden administration opt to do? On day one, almost 5 hours after his inauguration, Joe Biden banned the Keystone XL pipeline, which was a safe way to transport oil cleanly, and promised over 8,000 good-paying union jobs, according to Teamster President James Hoffa Jr. And then the Biden administration greenlit the Nord Stream 2 pipeline, handing over control of energy prices and diplomatic power to the Russians. Joe Biden also announced an unlawful ban on domestic oil and gas development, throwing the industry into chaos and endangering our livelihoods dependent on good-paying jobs. This administration also rolled back imperative NEPA reforms that streamlined burdensome, redundant regulations. And what was the result? Skyrocketing gas prices, record inflation. Life is simply more expensive for Americans under the Biden administration. More expensive to heat our homes, more expensive to drive our kids to school or drive to work. And in response, Joe Biden and his administration, and you can't make this up, begged OPEC to release more oil. They begged OPEC to release more oil. Believe it or not, Mr. Chair, OPEC did not oblige the Biden administration, even after getting their feet kissed by seemingly every senior member of the Biden's team. So after failing to secure more oil from a Mideastern cartel, Democrats moved to release oil from the Strategic Petroleum Reserve with the goal of stabilizing energy costs, a very recent darling and supposed silver bullet of this administration. But let's not forget attitudes from the other side of the aisle towards the SPR under the Trump administration. After President Trump's Energy Secretary Dan Brouillette called for filling the reserve in case of hard times, Democrats literally called it a bailout for oil and gas. The hypocrisy is astounding. This all could have been avoided. The Biden administration made conscious choices to make life more expensive for Americans and to buy energy that we desperately need from the world's worst polluters and our adversarial nations. Minnesota, for example, is in heating season. We need middle-class Minnesotans and Americans to be able to afford the energy to heat their homes and keep their children safe. So now, what does the administration and Democrats on this panel propose to do? According to the report promised in early summer by Secretary Haaland, that was actually released last Friday after Thanksgiving, they want to further kneecap production on federal lands, raise royalties, raise rental fees and bids, create more barriers to production, all in the name of reducing emissions. But as we discussed earlier, we have been reducing emissions for the last decade and a half. And let's end with just one more fact on emissions. If we implemented all of the so-called reforms called by Democrats on this panel and in the administration's report, we would see only a 0.08 degree decrease in global temperatures by the year 2100. Mr. Chair, that is 8/100ths of a Celsius degree in the next 79 years. In closing, I want to ask this panel, is it worth it? Is killing jobs, making energy more expensive for the middle class, is cutting funding for conservation, and is rewarding our foreign adversaries, Russia and China, is it worth it? I think not. American energy producers do it the best with the least amount of emissions. And the technology is getting better every year. And we can show the world how to do it. We must not rely on China or Russia for secure energy. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Starr. I'm now going to introduce today's witnesses. Senator Carrie Hamblin is a New Mexico State Senator representing District 38 and the President and CEO of the Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce. Eric Schlenker-Goodrich is the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center, a public interest law firm that works to safeguard the public lands, the wildlife, and communities of the Western United States in the face of a changing climate. Jade Begay is the Climate Justice Campaign Director for the NDN Collective and a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. And Nick Loris is the Vice President of Public Policy at the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. Let me remind the witnesses that under our committee rules, they must limit their oral statements to 5 minutes, but that their entire statement will appear in the hearing record. When you begin, the timer will begin, and it will turn orange when you have 1 minute remaining. I recommend that members and witnesses joining remotely use stage view so that they may pin the timer on their screen. After your testimony is complete, please remember to mute yourself to avoid any inadvertent background noise. I will allow the entire panel to testify before questioning the witnesses. The chair now recognizes Senator Hamblin for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee, Senator Hamblin.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. Chairman Grijalba, nice to see your face.
Mr. Chair, this is Ranking Member
Yes.
Sauber.
Yes,
I apologize for interrupting, but Chair Westerman was scheduled to have Ranking Member Westerman was scheduled to have an opening statement. I apologize if you or your staff didn't get that. Is that appropriate at this moment?
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Senator Semblin, I would like you to wait to begin your testimony out of courtesy to our overall committee ranking member. I recognize Ranking Member Westerman for
Thank
5
you, Mr.
minutes.
Chairman.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and thank you to the witnesses for taking time to join us today. The U.S. oil and gas industry continues to develop new technologies to detect and capture methane emissions relative to production in the largest producing oil and gas basins were down nearly 70% between 2011 and 2018 and continued to trend downward. Additionally, while natural gas production increased more than 50% from 1990 to 2017, methane emissions from natural gas actually decreased by 14%. This explosion in the use of natural gas has allowed the U.S. to lower our overall greenhouse gas emissions, and it's one example of using technology and innovation to combat carbon emissions. These efforts demonstrate industry expertise and buy-in, and it illustrates how it is critical to increasing the sequestration of methane and CO2 and prove that we can reduce emissions while guaranteeing our nation's energy security. Assaulting industry with imposed costs and new regulations like those proposed in the oil and gas leasing report will only drive up energy costs for American families, push production and U.S. jobs overseas, and ultimately increase emissions worldwide. Unfortunately, the attacks on American energy independence are not just coming from the administration. As we've seen a few weeks ago, Democrat members in Congress urged the president to ban oil exports, a move which would increase gas prices, cripple U.S. domestic production, and would result in more oil being used from overseas. This move would also have dire impacts on U.S. communities by eliminating thousands of jobs and essential revenues for schools and other essential services. Lastly, this would be a gift to Russia and other OPEC plus countries who would take over our global market share, which would increase emissions as the oil produced by OPEC plus is much dirtier and harder to refine. We must start working together to incentivize innovation and existing proactive efforts while encouraging more U.S. production to displace foreign sources to lower emissions. Additionally, one of the easiest ways to decrease emissions while lowering the cost of energy domestically is to streamline the development of critical energy infrastructure like pipelines. The Trump administration aimed to expedite this process by directing federal agencies to streamline regulations, provide certainty, encourage investment, and improve the process for securing rights of way. The Trump administration also issued reforms to NEPA, which would have improved the permitting process for domestic pipeline development. Unfortunately, the current administration announced last month that it would begin rolling back these critical reforms, a move that will only worsen their current energy crisis and lead to more emissions. This administration and Democrats in Congress must face the reality that as long as we attack and threaten domestic energy production, U.S. consumers are the ones who will pay dearly. Instead, I believe we must aim to combat emissions and stabilize U.S. energy security by incentivizing more innovation, expediting infrastructure development, and encouraging responsible production. If we could come together with a common goal to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, then I think the proper strategy is to look at a three-pronged approach to energy. First, we need to look at what is the most reliable, what is the most affordable, and what is the cleanest. And the reason I use those three criteria is if you look across the world at global greenhouse gas emissions, you know that it's a global issue. And if we're at only 15% of global emissions, we can't have that big of an impact just by changing what we do here at home. We have to come up with the innovation and technology that gets adopted across the world. And if you look at the technology that's being adopted right now, you have to look no further than China, who last year built 38 gigawatts of coal-powered plants. 38 gigawatts. That is one large, massive coal-fired plant every week. That's the trajectory that China is on. Why did they do that? They did it because coal is reliable, it's very reliable, and it's very low cost. We have to be the innovators to come up with what's reliable, what is low cost, and what is the cleanest, so that when developing countries and countries like China, who obviously don't care about the climate, they will adapt the technology because it's reliable and low cost. But we need to figure out how to make it cleaner. So instead of attacking our very good energy industry here, the cleanest in the world, the most reliable, and instead of putting the burden on American taxpayers when it's not going to do squat to help global greenhouse gas emissions, we should really focus on a common objective and use our innovation and technology to help change the world. I hope we can focus on those issues rather than just attacking American industry and American jobs. And with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman, for your opening statement. The chair once again recognizes Senator Hamlin for 5 minutes of testimony. Welcome again to the committee.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for inviting me to testify today about oil and gas leasing on public lands and how it impacts New Mexico. I'm pleased to bring my perspective to the committee today on this incredibly important issue to my state and to our country. It's also nice to see some familiar faces on the committee. As you mentioned, I am a state senator. I'm also the president and CEO of the Las Cruces Green Chamber of Commerce. Our organization creates awareness of sustainable business practices to build a thriving community for today and generations to come. We focus on creating sustainable communities, supporting our local businesses, and protecting our air, land, and water. I'm speaking to you today from my home, located on the sacred land of the Piro and Manso tribes and the Mescalero and Chiricahua Apache tribes. As the Biden administration moves forward with oil and gas leasing as a result of the court order from earlier this year, it is essential that the administration and Congress recognize that not only is the current federal oil and gas program broken, but the entire system of fossil fuel dependency is broken. The impacts of high oil and gas prices show us the danger of this dependence. In my written testimony, I highlighted several reasons why I believe New Mexico and our nation are long overdue for changes to how our public lands are used for oil and gas development, and for time's sake, I'm only going to touch on a couple of them. First and foremost, we need a serious conversation about economic diversity. As you likely know, New Mexico is among the states most dependent on oil and gas. And since the early days of our statehood, revenues from oil and gas leasing have provided billions of dollars for our public schools, hospitals, and other important priorities, and for that we are grateful. But those benefits have come with a hefty price. When the busts come, they come swiftly, and they can last for years. I can tell you as a New Mexico legislator, it turns our entire state budget process upside down, as we recently learned during the COVID-19 pandemic. Committee members, we are running out of time. Secondly, the dangers posed by climate change necessitate a new approach. Myself and 23 colleagues in the New Mexico legislature wrote a letter to President Biden and Interior Secretary Haaland stating that we recognize the significant contributions the oil and gas industry has made to New Mexico. But those contributions are based on a system that has not changed in more than a century. And the reality is we cannot afford another 100 years of the status quo. And because of the challenges we face, we can no longer ignore the negative effects of this industry on our state and on our future. In our addition to our economy, it touches every aspect of our air, land, water, wildlife, and the health of our communities. Committee members, we are running out of time. Oil and gas pollution is a social and environmental justice issue, and communities across the country are being treated as disposable so that money can be made by the few off of the backs of the many. But it is important that we identify these communities so they don't get folded into an umbrella term. Native American, Hispanic, African American, and low-income people in New Mexico are disproportionately suffering the impacts of climate change and pollution. Many of these communities are physically located near toxic facilities, and today they remain extremely vulnerable to chronic illness, disease, and death. These realities are the heart of why we need to completely rethink how we manage our public lands for oil and gas development. Committee members, we are running out of time. We need to acknowledge the economic benefits untouched or protected public lands have on tourism and local businesses. We know that protected public lands have a positive effect on local economies. In Las Cruces, visitorship to the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument, which was designated in 2014, jumped by 100% in the first 3 years of designation. Local businesses have created OMDP products, started incorporating the monument in their publicity materials, and encouraged their customers to enjoy the monument. They have become thoughtful stewards of our public lands. Our city of Las Cruces has created the Monuments to Main Street Month, which is a celebration in September of our public spaces and our community celebrations. And despite the challenges of COVID-19, we know that the outdoor recreation economy is generating billions of dollars throughout the country. In New Mexico, it has contributed $1.8 billion to our economy, created almost 26,000 direct jobs, and added $1.1 billion in wages and salaries. Committee members, we are running out of time. Mr. Chairman and members of the committee, it is no secret that New Mexico is in a unique position when it comes to oil and gas leasing. More than any other state, we know that we must do everything possible to attract more investments that diversify our economy and energy portfolio so that we are not left dependent on a declining industry. In order to provide a healthy and prosperous economy and environment for our citizens, we need an all-of-government approach. I am encouraged by the actions taken to date and look forward to working with the administration and members of Congress and my colleagues in the state legislature to ensure additional reforms are carried out in the best interest of New Mexico and our nation. Thank you for the opportunity to testify, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you, Senator Hamlin. The chair now recognizes Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich.
Good morning, Chairman of the committee. I'm grateful for the opportunity to speak with you today. I am the Executive Director of the Western Environmental Law Center, and I live in Taos, New Mexico, between the Rio Grande and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains, on land whose legacy traces back to Tiwa peoples. WELC is a public interest environmental law firm that uses the power of the law to safeguard the public lands, wildlife, and communities of the Western United States in the face of a changing climate. I'd like to ground my opening remarks in the wise words of Aldo Leopold from the foreword of his iconic Sand County Almanac. We abuse land because we regard it as a commodity belonging to us. When we see land as a community to which we belong, we may begin to use it with love and respect. Leopold's words infuse a core principle I'd like to leave with all of you today, that public lands are an element of our country's heritage, held by the federal government for the benefit of the whole American people and all who call our country home. Yet the federal public lands oil and gas program subordinates the public interest to the oil and gas industry's interest. In many respects, this inversion of interests is precisely what has contributed to the moment we find ourselves in, a moment where the United States has witnessed brutal heat waves, raging wildfires, and catastrophic floods. The Biden administration sought to remedy this dynamic on January 27th when it signed Executive Order 14008. The Biden administration, with that order, stated it would employ a whole-of-government approach to nudge our country onto a shared path towards a thriving, climate-resilient future. Section 208 of that order directed Interior to complete a comprehensive review of the federal public lands oil and gas program. Last Friday, the day after Thanksgiving, Interior concluded that review. It gives me no great pleasure to state that the report fails to deliver on the Biden administration's climate commitments. The report references climate a mere 4 times, once when it references the title to Executive Order 14008, once in a footnote, and twice in substance-free introductory language. Most egregiously, the report fails to reflect Interior's expansive constitutional and statutory responsibilities to address the climate crisis and to manage federal public lands in trust for all of us. So what does the report do? Very little, really. The report makes no decisions and issues no new policies or reforms. Instead, it cobbles together a package of recommended fiscal reforms. These reforms, however, are prospective, involving adjustments to royalty rates, minimum bids, lease rental fees, and reclamation bonds that have long been under consideration. This doesn't mean these ideas are bad, only that they fail to meet the moment demanded by the climate crisis. Moreover, it's far from clear that these fiscal reforms would even ensure a fair return to American taxpayers. Take, for example, a potential upward adjustment of royalty rates. Such an adjustment, as I understand it, would only apply to future leases. It would not apply to the 26 million acres of federal public lands already leased to oil and gas companies. It also presumes that Interior will continue to sell leases to oil and gas companies, even as these companies have more than 13 million acre surplus of non-producing leases and an ever-growing stockpile of nearly 10,000 drilling permits. Notwithstanding predictable industry claims that the sky is falling because of the Biden administration's climate actions, the unfortunate reality is that Interior, under the Biden administration, has approved new drilling permits at a rate greater than the prior administration, an administration whose fidelity to climate science was, shall we say, questionable. Yet opportunity abounds if only Interior would seize it. I'd therefore like to illuminate a path to that opportunity. First, Interior should immediately craft rules to implement and comply with the Federal Land Policy and Management Act of 1976. FLPMA contains a host of provisions, such as mandates against action that would cause permanent impairment of public lands, that have too long been ignored, but could be harnessed in service of climate action. Second, Interior should craft a comprehensive public lands-wide climate action framework. This framework should prohibit or sharply reduce leasing and drilling and chart a multi-year managed transition away from oil and gas production. Third, and pending the first two actions, Interior should impose interim guardrails on any new oil and gas leases and drilling permits to mitigate further harm to the climate. Absent such guardrails, permit approvals should be deferred. Fourth and finally, the federal government should work with states, tribes, local governments to foster a just and equitable transition for communities now dependent on oil and gas for revenue and jobs. Such a transition would offer communities and working families what they have never before been provided: the freedom to choose an economic pathway that is not shackled to an industry that harms the climate, public lands, or people. I welcome your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich. The chair now recognizes Ms. Begay for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee, Ms. Begay.
Thank you, Chairperson Lowenthal, Ranking Member Stauber, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you all for taking the time to hear and consider our testimonies today. My name is Jade Begay. I am a citizen of Tesuque Pueblo, located in northern New Mexico, and a descendant of the Diné Nation and the Southern Ute Tribe. I am the Climate Justice Campaign Director at NDN Collective and a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. I organize and do work so that our leadership, especially Indigenous, Native, and tribal leadership, is included in and honored in all decisions impacting our livelihoods, our health, and our territories and homelands. Just over a little 2 weeks ago, I was in Glasgow, Scotland, meeting with your colleagues, including the White House Climate Advisor, Gina McCarthy, and U.S. Special Envoy on Climate, John Kerry. My team met with these leaders in order to foster a partnership on strengthening the Build Back Better Act, climate policy abroad, and to share our expertise on how the whole of government response to the climate crisis can be implemented equitably and efficiently. I remember saying one afternoon in the U.S. delegation offices that in order to get it right on the international level, we first must get it right at home. And that is precisely why I'm here today, affirming what we all already know to be true, which is that more public land leasing to oil and gas to the oil and gas industry means that we will not achieve our climate targets. And instead, we will be violating commitments the U.S. made to the global community around reducing emissions as a nation. Leasing lands to oil and gas industries will move us closer towards catastrophic climate change and cost the U.S. billions of dollars in potential future climate damages. When I hear that the Biden administration is preparing to mount a whole of government response to the climate crisis alongside a whole of government equity agenda, and that every U.S. agency is meant to be a climate and equity agency, I cannot help but feel misled, disheartened, and disappointed when I witness actions such as the Department of Interior taking steps to lease more public lands to oil and gas. I will not stay quiet when I see the promises made to our people during campaign seasons being blatantly broken, all in the name of profit. Alongside countless others who worked to defend our rights to vote, to flip critical states like Arizona, to mobilize our people to the polls in the midst of a deadly pandemic, I worked to elect candidates that shared our goals in addressing the challenges we are facing caused by the climate crisis. We organized and mobilized because we trusted your commitments to make the right decisions for the health and safety of our communities. We worked especially hard in key battleground states for Indigenous peoples like Arizona, Nevada, and Colorado. And it is now a very sad irony that these states are largely where these happen. We had hoped our shared climate justice goals would be the foundation to honor past, present, and future promises made to our communities. Instead, we see the continued collaboration with oil and gas companies who are polluting our waters, destroying our lands, traditional knowledge, and jeopardizing the future of our young people. So I urge the Congress, please do not forget that you are here to serve us and work with us. Right now, while so many of us are vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, we are also very ready to work with each of you and the entire federal family to build the solutions we need. I will close my testimony by making one ask to the U.S. government as you consider the proposal for another round of oil and gas sales early next year. And that is that I urge you to make the leasing pause permanent. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Ms. Begay. The chair now recognizes Mr. Loris for 5 minutes. Welcome to the committee, Mr. Loris. Pleasure to see you again.
Thank you, and good morning. It's great to see you too, Chairman and Chairman Lowenthal and Ranking Member Stauber, and distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for this opportunity to testify this morning. My name is Nick Loris, and I'm the Vice President of Public Policy at the Conservative Coalition for Climate Solutions. We are a think tank that focuses on empowering entrepreneurs and innovators to deliver affordable, reliable energy, solve environmental challenges, and reduce the risks of climate change. And with my time today, I'd like to make 3 brief observations. The first is that with any policy or regulation, Congress and agencies should appropriately weigh the costs and the benefits. And regarding prohibitions of oil and gas development on federal lands, the economic costs significantly outweigh the climate benefits. More oil and gas extraction on federal lands would have minimal climate impact because these activities represent a small percentage of global greenhouse gas emissions. According to 2019 Bureau of Land Management data, oil and gas development on public lands is responsible for 6.5% of total greenhouse gas emissions and just 0.7% of global emissions. However, these emissions numbers by themselves do not provide policymakers with the full context of the climate impact from energy production on federal lands. A useful tool for doing so is the Model for the Assessment of Greenhouse Gas-Induced Climate Change, or MAGIC model. This is a model that was developed at the National Center for Atmospheric Research, and it quantifies the temperature impact and sea level changes from increases and decreases in greenhouse gas emissions. Running this MAGIC model and inputting emissions increases from greater oil and gas supplies, which is defined by the U.S. Energy Information Administration as a 50% increase above the baseline case or reference case, this would only increase global temperatures by 0.03 of a degree Celsius by the year 2100. Similarly, eliminating coal, oil, and natural gas extraction on federal lands would have minimal climate benefits, resulting in only 0.08 of a degree Celsius of averted warming by the turn of the century. However, restrictions on energy development would come at significant cost to consumers, to Western states, and to the broader economy. Energy production on public lands is an important jobs creator, and the revenues are a critical funding source for schools, hospitals, tribes, and conservation efforts. While economic diversification is sensible for states, the fiscal and economic costs of leasing moratoriums could cost Western states hundreds of billions of dollars. According to University of Wyoming economist Timothy Considine, a leasing moratorium could result in $372 billion in lost investment, $478 billion in lost productivity, and $114 billion in fiscal losses over a 20-year period. The cumulative job losses for the 8 Western states Considine analyzed would reach more than 340,000 by the year 2040. Secondly, policymakers should consider the unintended environmental consequences that will inevitably occur because of emissions leakage if the federal government restricts development on public lands. Production would shift to private and state-owned lands and would shift overseas where the environmental standards are not as rigorous. One analysis from Resources for the Future estimates that the emissions leakage could be as high as 73%. Furthermore, reductions in natural gas supply could increase prices and result in a switch back to coal, or result in utilities keeping their existing coal-fired generation online longer than they otherwise would. The end result may be a much smaller than anticipated reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, or potentially a net increase in emissions. Third, there are many productive ways to reduce emissions from activities on federal lands. For instance, integrating natural climate solutions to remediation and abandoned mine sites could minimize environmental liabilities and reduce emissions. Improving soil health, planting more trees, and eradicating invasive species could provide opportunities for economic development, job creation, and also sequestering more carbon dioxide. Moreover, expediting permitting that maintains environmental safeguards and inputs from communities would expand low carbon and zero emissions technologies on public, state, and private lands. Global decarbonization will not just come from cost reduction in clean energy sources and technologies, but efficient and scalable deployment. In conclusion, affordable, dependable power is essential for our well-being and standards of living. When Americans pay more for electricity and at the pump, fewer dollars are available for healthcare, for clothes, and for food. Policies that drive energy prices higher are regressive, disproportionately harming older populations, low-income families, and communities of color. At the same time, climate change is real, presents real risks to communities, and demands attention. Climate change is a global challenge, and expanding economic freedom in the United States and around the world can increase prosperity while reducing the risks of human-induced warming. By breaking down barriers to innovation, investment, and deployment, and employing a whole of society and a whole of markets approach, the U.S. can continue to demonstrate that strong economic growth and emissions reductions are not mutually exclusive. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Loris. And I thank all the panel for their testimony. I want to remind the members that Committee Rule 3D imposes a 5-minute limit on questions. The chair is now going to recognize members for any questions they may wish to ask witnesses, and I'm going to recognize myself first for 5 minutes of questions. The first question goes to Senator Hamlin. In your testimony, you referenced a letter that you led from the New Mexico State Legislature and legislators to President Biden, calling for increasing, in part, increasing the oil and gas royalty rates on public lands. My question is, how is increasing the royalty rate going to impact the state of New Mexico financially? And, we always hear about, anytime we raise rates, it's going to drive jobs away. Do you believe that it might drive jobs out of the state to places like Texas or Oklahoma? Question is to Senator Hamlin.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal. No, I don't think it's going to drive jobs out of the state. We have oil and gas here, and I can tell you that if there's money to be made off of it, even if it means risking the health and well-being of people, the oil and gas companies are going to drill it. And as long as we keep the antiquated system in place, it's going to continue. One of the things that you've mentioned, Chairman, is the royalty rate. So in New Mexico, the royalty rate for production on state lands is as high as 20%. The Bureau of Land Management rate is just 12.5% for production on federal lands. That's even lower than the federal offshore rate. So if there was equity in the royalty rates, our school children would be getting their fair share of oil and gas revenues. But because the rental and royalty rates for drilling on federal lands are beyond outdated, some have not been revised in over a century, Our state has lost out on billions of dollars that could have been used for teacher raises, school materials, and supporting student success in the classroom. And that report released last week from the Department of Interior lays out how, over the years, the program has let oil and gas CEOs game the system and drive the decision-making process, and it's shortchanging not only people in New Mexico, but American taxpayers, and also harming our public lands and our waters and our wildlife along the way. You know, New Mexico is the second largest oil-producing state, and we're going to continue to make money off of it, but we're not making what we deserve as a state that is allowing our public lands to be damaged by an extractive industry. And we need to put equity into the royalty rates in order for our communities to benefit. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Senator. Now I want to turn to Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich. Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich, can you explain for the committee the concept of the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions? While many of us are familiar with the term, others may not be. And I want us to have a common understanding of what we're talking about here. Is the social cost of greenhouse gas emissions accounted for in the prices that companies pay for oil and gas leases on public lands?
Thank you, Chairman. The social cost of carbon is an estimate of the economic costs or damages of emitting 1 additional ton of carbon dioxide equivalent into the atmosphere. In other words, we're monetizing all of the costs of those greenhouse gas emissions, even though typically those costs are shifted onto the shoulders of the public and otherwise hidden. The Biden administration is using an interim social cost of carbon of $51 per ton. There's a general consensus in the scientific community that this figure is too low. And then in terms of the application of the social cost of carbon, it's used typically in regulatory circumstances. So when a rule is being promulgated by an agency. The Interior Department is starting to integrate that into its decisions on oil and gas, but almost only for informational purposes. In other words, the social cost of carbon is perhaps assessed, but it is not actually a driver of the ultimate decision reached by the Interior. One of the reasons why we're seeing the stockpiling of oil and gas permits by industry that effectively are being rubber stamped by the Biden administration. They're not accounting for it in actual decision making.
I just have a little bit of time left, and so I'm going to begin the question. Ms. Begay, you mentioned you're traveling to Scotland last month for the COP26. You met with several officials, government officials, a number of members of this committee, myself included, were also able to attend. Was the topic of fossil fuel extraction, including from public lands, discussed? And do you feel encouraged that the U.S. is moving in the right direction on this front? Maybe a quick answer.
Yeah. I would say most of the conversations I witnessed were about the U.S.'s climate commitments and initiatives, and about this broad goal of achieving net zero. And actually what we advocate is for achieving zero emissions. Regardless, the conversation seemed to be more focused on carbon market solutions rather than cutting emissions at the source, ending fossil fuel subsidies, and stopping new oil leases, both onshore and offshore. In the future, I think it'd be very meaningful, certainly to someone like me, to see more conversations about this topic, fossil fuel extraction on public lands, and conversations that are similar to the one we're having
I want
today.
to thank you, but we've kind of reached the end of our time. It's actually gone over. I would now like to recognize Ranking Member Westerman for his questions.
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for your testimony today. This is a subject we need to talk about. We need to search for the truth in what's actually happening in the world. We need to rely on science. We need to rely on data, and we need to do the right thing. And what I think is being proposed is not the right thing. I think it's the wrong path that we should take. Mr. Goodrich quoted somebody that I've read a lot about. He's actually a fellow Yale forester, Aldo Leopold, in his famous Sand County Almanac. And I think Leopold often gets misunderstood, and people think he was a preservationist. He was not. He was a conservationist. And one of the quotes I like from Leopold is when he said, "There are two spiritual dangers in not owning a farm. One is the danger of supposing that breakfast comes from the grocery, and the other is that heat comes from the furnace." And I think we live in a world today where people are very disconnected from rural America. They're very disconnected from where the things we enjoy come from. I think people actually think food comes from the grocery store and that heat just comes from the furnace, and they don't appreciate the supply chains and the technology and the American ingenuity that goes behind getting food to the grocery store and getting energy to the places that we use it. And like I said, Leopold was a conservationist. He even he promoted using land and using land. That's the important thing, with love and respect. And that's what conservation is using what we have and taking care of it and passing it along better to future generations. And I believe we're on a wrong path where we're not focusing on the real issue. If the desire is to remove carbon from the atmosphere, what's being proposed is not going to do that. Mr. Goodrich, you were asked to explain the social cost of drilling, but can you explain the social cost of inflated energy and food prices to low-income individuals?
Certainly, Representative. I'd note I'd love to get into a longer discussion about Leopold, and I, in fact, grew up on a small farm on the Hudson River, so I'm well aware of that supply chain and how important it is to have a sense of raising your own food and a connection to the land itself. In terms of the social cost of carbon, the idea isn't that you suddenly ignore, say, the economic benefits of oil and gas drilling. The idea is that you use economics 101 in the sense that you look at the full suite of benefits of oil and gas drilling, and you also look at the full suite of costs to society. Market dynamics, no one opposes the idea, at least I don't oppose the idea of using market dynamics to understand what are the costs and benefits of a particular action. I do think that we should be cautious about using only costs and benefits, for example, with oil and gas drilling, because the reality is that some of these costs involve human life.
Mr. Goodrich, if I can interrupt, I didn't ask about the social benefits of carbon. I asked about the negative benefits of increasing food and energy prices to low-income individuals, which if these policies are put in place, it's going to increase the price of energy, which a lot of people I don't think realize that natural gas produces the nitrogen and nitrogen fertilizer that goes to produce a lot of the food. So when you increase energy costs, you're also increasing food cost. And I think we fail to look at the social cost of low-income individuals when we make necessities that a lot of people can afford to pay more for, but low-income individuals can't afford that. Mr. Loris, you talked a lot about global climate, global emissions, and I think you stated very well that we have a common goal to reduce those emissions, but this is just not the right way to do it. Should we be looking more at nuclear and possibly nuclear with hydrogen for transportation versus this emphasis that's being put so much on electric vehicles, which our electrical grid cannot support, which we cannot produce the electricity from renewable sources to power electric vehicles, and overall electric vehicles only in the U.S. would only reduce greenhouse gas emissions on a global scale by a minute point.
Yeah, to your point about driving emissions reductions globally, I think the best way to do that is by lowering the cost of technologies, and that can be everything from liquefied natural gas to nuclear to renewables and battery. I do think all of these can play an integral role in driving deep decarbonization, and I think the markets will do that. We've seen costs come down. I think part of the problem is the permitting process to scale up some of these technologies has taken a very long time. And that is not helping drive the cost and deployment in developing countries. And to your point about the increased growth of coal emissions from China, that 38 gigawatts that China built last year is more than 3 times more than any other all of the countries combined have built around the world. And so to have it be in their self-interest to pursue low carbon technologies, we need all of these technologies to the cost to come down and the deployment to scale up rather efficiently.
Thank you. I assume I'm over time, Mr. Chairman, so I yield back.
Thank you, Ranking Member Westerman. I now recognize the chair of the full Committee of Natural Resources, Chairman Grijalva, for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chair Lowenthal. Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and for holding a very timely and important hearing, and for all the witnesses for joining us today. Thank you. While several of my committee colleagues, including our esteemed chairman of the subcommittee, Mr. Lowenthal, when we were in Scotland last month at the COP26, we stressed to the international community that the United States is back and is once again ready to lead global efforts to combat climate change. But to lead in the world, we need to get our own house in order as well. And this includes managing and reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our public lands and waters. And as has been discussed today, America's public lands are a major source of carbon pollution, but the administration has a great deal of existing authority presently to begin to control and ramp down these emissions. From limiting or ending new leasing to strengthening regulations to make companies pay for the climate damage they cause, and either use it or lose it, lease program that could be a regulatory change that is badly needed. There's a lot that the Interior Department can do, and there's a lot that they must do. And I think we need to continue to push them to do more when it comes to getting emissions under control on our public lands and waters. Let me begin with Senator Hamblin. It's good to see you again. And enjoyed our visit there, and I'm very appreciative for the hospitality in Las Cruces that you, the chamber, and others provided. Thanks a lot. Senator, it's good to see you, but climate change is affecting the people of New Mexico, and how is it affecting it? And does more and more drilling on public lands exacerbate the impacts your state and the West more broadly than it's already experiencing? How do you
Chairman
see?
Grijalva, but thank you so much, and it is good to see you. And I do hope you've made the chili rellenos that the recipe that I provided for you a while ago. It is good to see your face.
There's been efforts.
Oh, okay, good for you. Good for you. Well, thank you so much. So, in New Mexico, this is not something we're proud of. There are several things that we're proud of. We're proud of our good food, and we're proud of our incredible, beautiful skies and the landscapes and the mountains that surround us. The thing that we are not proud of is the fact that we have the largest methane gas cloud in the world that can be seen from space. It's 2,500 square miles that is visible from space. It touches 2 different tribal lands and impacts populations that don't have access to resources to improve their quality of life. And it is incredibly important to reduce the methane emissions. That is how that is impacting our state. When we talk about drilling on public lands, I'm sorry, Mr. Chairman.
Yeah, I'm just going to get to a question for Ms. Begay.
Sure thing.
Ms. Begay, and thank you for being here in your testimony. As a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council, what types of changes do you think need to be made on how the Interior Department manages fossil fuels to address the current and historic environmental injustices from drilling on public land and water? How do you see Interior and the role that they need to play a much bigger and much broader role within this administration? Ms. Begay?
Thank you, Chair Grijalva. Well, for transparency, I can't speak on behalf of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Council. So speaking from my NDN collective capacity, I ask that the Department of Interior and the Congress continue to challenge the June 2021 injunction and use policies and the authority that the Secretary Interior has to end lease sales on public lands. Furthermore, last week, we all know about the report that the DOI put out on federal leasing, the federal leasing program, and the agency states that the oil, quote, the oil and gas industry has a substantial number of unused permits to drill onshore. As of September 30th, 2021, the oil and gas industry holds more than 9,600 approved permits that are available to drill. The report also goes on to say, but this speculative approach contributes to unbalanced land management. So I am actually curious why this surplus is being created when the DOI itself sees it as unbalanced.
It's speculative and it's and to some extent monopolizing.
Right.
I agree with you. I think that's one area in which Interior needs to do something. It's the hoarding of leases for the purposes of
Right.
controlling price, for the purposes of controlling and limiting the market. And, people complain about we need more and more drilling. One of the facts is that all those are hoarded and no one can explain what the purpose of that is. And I think if you're not using it, you lose it. And then we have many options once that is lost. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the indulgence of the extra time. Appreciate it.
Thank you, Chairman Grijalva. I now recognize Representative Graves for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome, the representative from Louisiana with your new football coach at LSU. Is Representative Graves there?
Mr. Chair, we're having trouble getting Representative Graves.
Why
If
don't
you're
Mr.
okay,
Yes.
you're okay, I will go.
You'll go? That's fine. And then we'll come back to Mr. Graves.
Okay, Mr. Chair, I think Graves just came on. I apologize.
No, that's fine. It's fine. Thank you for your offer of help. Representative Graves, you're recognized for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome to the committee. Is Representative Graves there? Well, I'm going to ask Ranking Member Stauber to do 5 minutes of questions, and we'll come back to Mr. Graves immediately after.
Okay.
Well,
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the witnesses' testimony today. I just want to respond to Senator Hamlin. Just a reminder that former Vice President Al Gore said in 2009 that the North Pole will be ice-free in the summer by 2013 because of man-made global warming, end quote. And to Ms. Begay, I too will not quit fighting for energy prices that are reasonable. In northern Minnesota, we should not have to make a decision whether we heat our homes or put food on our tables. Low-cost energy is what the middle class needs. And so I will say, let's work on all of the above energy strategies. And you did note that you went to Glasgow, Scotland. My assumption is you use jet fuel, and that might be an assumption that's probably absolutely true. So with that being said, Mr. Loris, thank you so much for joining us today. Northeastern Minnesota gets cold. In fact, temperatures can get to 60 below or worse. You mentioned the correlation between natural gas prices and mortality in the winter. Can you discuss how the shale and natural gas revolution helped save lives over the years?
Yeah, thank you for the question. We know that mortality rates rise in colder months. The exposure to cold is the reason that mortality peaks in the winter, and higher home heating prices increase that exposure because it reduces heating use and raises energy bills. And that also might reduce spending on health promotion, and that can result in higher mortality rates as well. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, because of the shale revolution, we've seen that affordable, reliable energy and affordable, reliable heat saves lives. There was a paper that was initially in the National Bureau of Economic Research that was later published in an economics and statistics journal that found, because of the shale revolution, natural gas prices dropped 42% in the late 2000s and averted 13,000 winter deaths per year. And that same study found that the positive impacts were especially large in high poverty communities. So, this is, again, statistically proven that affordable, reliable energy, and also especially because of the shale revolution, has quite literally saved lives.
We know that, low-cost energy, reliable energy is extremely important for us and the lower and middle class. We cannot afford, the constituents cannot afford to pay double the price of electricity or natural gas to heat their homes. When we in Minnesota, when we flip that switch to the furnace to come on, that's helping our families and children stay warm and comfortable in the cold winters. So with that, Senator Hamlin, thank you for joining us today. I was in your beautiful state of New Mexico, in Artesia, a beautiful city. The oil and gas industry in New Mexico contributed $176.1 million to education coffers in Doña Ana County alone last year across 77 K through 12 schools and nearly 40,000 students. If you had your way and the unlawful leasing ban took effect, those numbers would go down to zero, denying students in your single county $176 million. How would you propose making up that funding shortfall?
Thank you, Ranking Member, for the question. I do appreciate the opportunity. It's Doña Ana County, as our natives like to say, and it's one of the oldest county seats in the state, in beautiful southern New Mexico. And there's no denying that the oil and gas industry has supported many things. Education is one of those, hospitals is another. And one of the things that I have to recognize...
Senator, tell me more about the hospitals. Tell me what the oil and gas industry has done for the hospitals in your great state, specifically.
Well, if I can finish my statement, that would be great, and then I'll go ahead and address that. Do you mind?
We don't have a lot of time, so I would.
Well, I would like to answer your question though about diversifying our revenue stream, which we've done in the state already with taking steps to legalize adult use cannabis. We've taken those steps, Representative, and it's important that we continue on with that motivation, that momentum of creating more jobs that people.
I don't mean to be rude, Senator, but my time is limited. Specifically, tell us what the oil and gas industry has done to the hospital and your healthcare industry.
Well, actually, if I can answer your original question, though, about how to make up that revenue, if we're talking about, that was your original question, of how to make up that revenue, it's by diversifying our revenue streams. We've already started doing that with legalizing adult use cannabis, and we shouldn't stop. We have the momentum to do that. But I'm also, I have to tell you, though, in agreement, is that we're not going to stop the oil and gas industry tomorrow. We have people who depend on using their jobs in the oil and gas industry to put food on their tables. Absolutely. We have to, there's no reason why they shouldn't, they have every right to be worried. I'm not saying that we have to stop it tomorrow. Ideally, I'd like to. But the thing is that it is our job, both at the state level and at the local level and at the federal level, to create industries so people can put food on their tables and support their families. And so what we need to do is continue that momentum of creating different revenue streams. And we're doing it in New Mexico. We're starting that. To continue that momentum in order to create different jobs and training and careers for people who are working in this industry.
So if I heard you right, to make up for the revenue, one of the ways is going to legalize marijuana. Is that correct?
Representative, we've already legalized adult use cannabis in the state. And that is a start, and it is changing the opportunity, changing the different revenue streams. Any financial planner will tell you to diversify your portfolio. And we have not done that until this last year when we legalized adult use cannabis. We are starting that change in order to diversify our revenue streams so that we're not heavily dependent on something that is so volatile. Some years it can be great and our state benefits, and other years when oil and gas prices and oil and gas revenues are low, then our state budgets are impacted.
Well, Mr. Chair, I'm out of time, but I see that that the senator says that replacing the oil and gas revenue with legalizing marijuana helps the educational coffers. That's interesting. I'll yield back. Thank you.
Thank you, Ranking Member Stauber. The chair now recognizes Representative Levin for 5 minutes of questions.
Well, thank you,
Representative
Mr. Chairman.
Levin.
Thank you, Chairman, for holding this hearing. It's very timely, particularly on the heels of last week's release of the Interior's long-awaited review of the oil and gas leasing program. And look, the report is only a first step, but it makes clear that the federal oil and gas program does not provide a fair return to taxpayers, period, full stop, even without accounting for the program's significant contribution to climate change. And further, the report highlights how local communities are not getting a fair return from federal leasing. So with that, I wanted to turn to Senator Hamblin. You highlighted in your testimony how communities in New Mexico are negatively impacted by this boom and bust cycle of oil and gas extraction. And since New Mexico's economy is so deeply tied to oil and gas, fluctuations in the market can have large impacts on the state's economy and the state government revenues. So my question for you is, how does the volatility of fossil fuel extraction impact your state's ability to fund its budget priorities? And how would diversifying New Mexico's economy provide stability to the state's revenues?
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I appreciate the time. You know, as a state legislator, at this moment, because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we have seen how a volatile industry such as oil and gas, how the revenues, when they ebb and flow, is not the smart way to balance a state budget. So when revenues are low, budgets all over the state are negatively impacted and facing fear of being reduced. There are programs throughout the state that New Mexicans depend on that are all of a sudden cut. We had a veterans homeless program that the budget was cut a couple of years ago when the oil and gas revenues were down. And so then those agencies were providing services to help provide homes for individuals who have served our country and then now are experiencing homelessness. They had to scramble to get more money to provide homes for those veterans that have served our country and risked their lives. And so when we're diversifying our revenue streams, as we have taken that step, like many states, understanding that not only legalizing adult use cannabis, but also benefiting from our outdoor recreation economy, which, as I've mentioned, has contributed billions of dollars to the country as well as to New Mexico, that's where we can start looking at different opportunities. And I feel as a legislator in this state that it is our responsibility to create an industry where those folks who are working in oil and gas can go ahead and get trained in new skills to provide for their families. I have no doubt whatsoever that we can do that if we start embracing renewable energy and start putting the money to creating those industries. New Mexico has 350 days of sunshine a year. There is no reason why we should not be the solar capital of the country because of the opportunities that we present here. Diversifying our revenue streams, looking at different ways that are out of the box, that are long-term and sustainable, are what we need to do both at the state level and at the federal level. And by embracing renewable energy, looking at outdoor recreation as how that helps our communities and how that helps protect our public spaces, those are ways that we can do that. But certainly, I don't have the answers to all of that, but I think we have to start, and we can't slow down.
Well, along those lines, Senator, I completely agree with the emphasis on renewable energy on public lands. And we have a bill, the Public Land Renewable Energy Development Act, that would direct the Bureau of Land Management to establish priority areas for renewable energy development on our federal lands, and would also direct the federal government to distribute a share of revenue from wind and solar to the states and counties in which federal lands development takes place, as well as to federal land management agencies to assist with permitting. We're hopeful that these new revenue distribution streams will give stakeholders more skin in the game and ensure that impacted communities will get their fair share. So my question for you, Senator, is do you think that a revenue sharing mechanism between the federal government, states, and counties from solar and wind development on public lands would be a positive development for your community and for New Mexico?
Well, I think any opportunity, thank you, Representative. I do think any opportunity to put more of where we get our revenue streams, where we get our energy towards renewable energy, is certainly the right step. I don't know enough about the revenue sharing. I certainly want to make sure, in my job, I talk about keeping money local. And so I'd like to keep money in our state so that our communities benefit. But I would certainly appreciate more information on how we can do that, how not only New Mexico can benefit, but how we can go ahead and reduce those carbon emissions, the methane gas, and how those communities, especially in rural New Mexico, would be able to benefit from that. Because as we're talking about this with oil and gas drilling and extractive industries, it's those rural communities that are severely impacted by that. And when I talk about our BIPOC communities, our Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities being impacted, it's because that we are not giving them the resources that they need in order to have a good quality of life. So if we can make sure that that revenue sharing goes to those communities, you bet your bottom dollar I'll be on that.
So we're out of time, Mr. Chairman, but I just want to reemphasize that if we want to meet our climate goals, our economic goals, we need to not only transition away from fossil fuel extraction, but work to unleash responsible, renewable energy development on our public lands. And I'll yield back.
Thank you, Representative Levin. I now recognize Representative Graves, if you're able to connect.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Good to see you. Hope you're doing well. I want to thank the witnesses for being here today, and thank you for your testimony. Mr. Loris, I heard your testimony earlier, and I can't help but be very confused by why we have witnesses today that are talking about stopping domestic energy production whenever even the International Energy Agency has recognized the United States efforts with natural gas as being resulting in the most historic reductions in global emissions in world energy history. I can't understand why folks are talking about stopping domestic energy production whenever the International Energy Agency and UN and others have recognized there's going to continue to be a role for conventional fuels. And the offshore, for example, the area that I represent, the Gulf of Mexico, we have the lowest emissions per unit of energy, barrels of oil, cubic feet of gas in the United States, and some of the lowest in the world. Why would you take those solutions off the table as part of our long-term strategy to a clean energy future?
Yeah, I don't think you should. And in fact, you need to look at those unintended consequences. What happens if you do take those solutions off the table, full stop? I mean, the reason that we've seen this transition from coal to natural gas is largely through market forces. And if we restrict that oil and gas production here in the United States, it's going to be made up elsewhere by OPEC plus, and that's largely going to result in lost economic opportunities, but also probably larger emissions. And I think liquefied natural gas, again, can be part of the solution. The more we export that, there's been studies from the Department of Energy's National Energy Technology Laboratory and other studies that have shown the more we export our LNG and it displaces piped Russian gas or coal overseas, we can have that same impact overseas in terms of driving emissions reductions and economic growth.
And Mr. Loris, when we don't export our natural gas, does it mean that other countries don't use natural gas, or what happens?
Yeah, it means other countries are probably going to use coal or going to use Russian natural gas. And again, part of the global decarbonization effort needs to be driving down the cost for low carbon and emissions-free technologies. And natural gas is a cleaner alternative to those solutions. So it needs to be integral in those solutions as we consider renewables, as we consider fusion and fission and all the other electricity sources that are low carbon and carbon free. But we can't ignore the economic and environmental benefits that we've seen from increased natural gas in the United States and around the world.
Thank you, Mr. Loris. I continue to be so confused by why some members of this panel advocate or pretend to advocate for, or suggest they're advocating for a clean energy future, but actually push policies that result in higher global emissions and really benefit Vladimir Putin. Just to continue to be a real head scratcher for me. Senator Hamblin, I heard you mention earlier that that royalty rates had not changed in decades, and that taxpayers effectively weren't getting their value out of energy production. I just want to make clear that royalty rates are a percentage, therefore they do go up, and this is not a static figure. In addition, and this is something that members of this committee are well aware of, because we've clarified this to them repeatedly, there is actually an auction process. So for anyone to suggest before this committee that fair market value is not represented, that very clearly demonstrates a fundamental lack of understanding of the bidding process, of the leasing process. And I want to be clear on that. I'm happy to, you want to respond, but there is an auction, and royalty rates are a percentage. Therefore, they do change. And to suggest that because the royalty rate maybe hasn't changed in years or longer, that taxpayers aren't getting their value and revenue, I don't think that's really an accurate statement and shouldn't be conveyed to the public that way.
If I can respond, though, at the moment, though, thank you, Representative. At the moment, the royalty rate for production on state lands is 20%, and on public lands, federal lands, it's 12.5%. Why shouldn't they both be 20%?
Well, that's a great question. So a couple of things. I'm not familiar with New Mexico's process, but on federal lands, you have a bidding process. So there's an auction process. It's not just the royalty rate. It is what's called a bonus bid. As a matter of fact, in the offshore, we just had a bonus bid process where the federal government is going to receive nearly $200 million from a single lease sale. All last year, according to witness testimony, just last week or week before last, Department of Interior witness indicated they received $40 million all year from renewable energy. We received nearly $200 million from a single bonus bid lease sale, not including rents or any royalty payments. And those funds go to fund infrastructure, environmental programs, veterans programs, healthcare, senior programs, education. That's what funds our federal government, one of the largest sources of revenue in the United States. I'm over time. I apologize. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Graves. I now call upon Representative Porter for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair. Mr. Loris, you stated in your testimony that you are the Vice President of Public Policy at C3 Solutions. Could you say just a couple of words about why that qualifies you to be an expert witness before this panel on this subject?
Yeah, absolutely. At C3 Solutions, we are focused on ensuring that we have affordable, reliable energy and that we are reducing the risks of climate change. And I think a big part of that solution is to remove some of the government-imposed barriers to low carbon and carbon-free energy sources. So, our team was over in Glasgow as well, having conversations with renewable energy developers, with conventional fuel producers, with people who are proponents of free trade, and driving down the cost of these low carbon and emissions-free technologies. And so when I think about the conventional production in the United States, I want to look at the costs and the benefits of what some of those policies may look like, what that means for the impact on climate change, and what that means for the impact on global emissions. And so that's why
I wanted to follow up on that point about, I'm glad you brought up your role with going to Glasgow and global production. Are you a senior advisor at a consulting firm called Madras? And could you tell me a little bit about that role?
Yeah, sure. So I was connected through DJ Gribbin, who worked in the Trump administration on infrastructure policy, and I've done some work for them. Not a ton, to be honest with you, but a little work on them in terms of looking at processes like the National Environmental Policy Act, looking at energy transitions, what opportunities mean for companies and things like that.
So, Mr. Loris, I have a follow-up, if you don't mind, about Madras. Does Madras do any work for foreign governments?
Not that I'm aware of, but I honestly don't know. I could get back to you on that.
Did you ask them?
Not when I brought online, because I'm focused. Madras, as I understand it, the work that I do is focused largely on the think tank and the nonprofit side. And so
Mr. Loris, I wanted to ask you if this form looks familiar. I'll try to hold it up as close as I can.
Yeah.
This is your truth in testimony disclosure form that you filled out in advance of this hearing. Nowhere on this form does it mention Madras, but on this form, you specify that there are no payments for any entity that originated with a foreign government that are related to the subject's hearing or the organizations that you represent. But you listed nothing, but what you just testified is that you didn't ask the appropriate questions.
Yeah, well, I'm testifying in my capacity as the Vice President of Public Policy for the Conservative Coalition for Climate Change Solutions. I'm not here testifying in my capacity in any type of work that I've done for Madras, and so I don't necessarily see how that's relevant. My work for Madras has largely just been conversations that I've had and part of that think tank community,
So, Mr. Loris, let me stop you. I mean, Madras's consulting clients have included Australian oil and gas companies. Its partners include private equity firms with huge international holdings. And while I take you at your word that you yourself haven't been involved with any of that, the point of the truth in testimony disclosure is to give this information to this committee and to the American people so that they can then judge whether or not there is a conflict of interest. And I think this gap, when you're very happy to talk about your Madras background and your experiences, when I ask you about it in the hearing, yet you didn't disclose or ask the appropriate questions on the truth and disclosure form. And I think part of the problem here, in fairness, is we need to strengthen our truth in testimony disclosure rules. So there is clear instruction to a witness like yourself. And I think part of the problem is that people choose to read these rules in a way that lets them sort of choose their own adventure with regard to disclosure. I want to turn now really quickly to Ms. Senator Hamblin. Can you talk about the environmental restoration projects, such as cleaning up abandoned wells in New Mexico, and how that is helping to create good, high-paying jobs?
Representative, thank you. I'm totally fangirling right now for this. I appreciate the question from you. I don't have the answers to that, so I apologize that I'm not able to, but I can go ahead and provide that information to you by the end of the day today.
I would love to hear more about the way that whether environmental restoration jobs are consistent with the pay and benefits and opportunity for families in New Mexico that traditional oil and gas industry jobs are. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I yield back.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Representative Porter. I now recognize Representative Harrell for 5 minutes of questions. Representative Harrell.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, witnesses. And it truly is a great opportunity to have this conversation. And just a couple of remarks. I, for one, am very proud of the state of New Mexico. I represent over 100,000 constituents that are directly employed, either directly or indirectly employed by the oil and gas industry. And I'm proud that we are part of a coalition who can help provide energy independence around the state, around the country, and around the world. It's clean, it's reliable, it's affordable. And I think when we're talking the bigger picture and we're looking at people who are in the lower income or middle income earners, the fact that we're able to provide this kind of energy for their homes, their cars. And I want to make sure that we're very clear that the oil and gas industry is not driving the cost at the pump. I mean, the increase at the pump right now is a lack of production because of this administration and inflation. That's what's driving the cost up in America right now. I also want to echo, though, and a little bit disagree with the chairman. The U.S. is back. We are back to lead the world, but what we're doing is handing over the reins to energy independence to empower China, Russia, Saudi Arabia, and everyone else except the United States. So when we start talking about these policies, if we're not being very honest about who's affected, we're really just pushing industry and jobs to other countries, and we're going to become reliant on energy sources from countries that are not our friends. So we have to be very careful, I think. I want to apologize to Mr. Loris because, again, in this committee, we have a habit of putting the witnesses on trial instead of sticking to the point. So I think you are very well qualified to be here, and I appreciate your time. And if we're not more careful with disrespecting our witnesses, we won't be able to get witnesses to come to our committees. But with that being said, I would like to ask you, Mr. Loris, the administration has framed the cost increases in terms of leasing as fair return to the taxpayer. For example, they cite higher royalty rates on state lands as an indication that the existing federal rates are somehow giveaways to the oil and gas industry. Will these indeed be a greater return to the taxpayer if royalties, rents, or bonding requirements and fees are raised on federal lands, as the administration is trying to indicate?
Yeah, I think there's a couple things to consider, and changing the prices is going to change behavior, and that could change how companies make investments on public lands versus adjacent non-federal lands. So it could shift more production over there. At the same time, it could also change the bonus bid structure that Representative Graves talked about. If companies are taking into account the higher royalty rates, that may mean that the bonus bids are lower, and so fewer revenue dollars are coming in on the front end. So it may just be changing how the revenue changes over time, and be interested to see some analysis into what type of revenue is coming in from the bonus bid changes based on changes in the royalty rate if we were to increase them from 12% to 20%.
Right, and thank you for that. And I agree. As a state representative for 8 years in New Mexico, I get how reliant we are on the state's budget for the oil and gas industry. And the senator knows that they'll have over $2 billion in surplus directly due to the oil and gas industry this year. And one thing I would say for the state of New Mexico, and while we understand the importance of the industry, not only for the state's budget, schools, hospitals, infrastructure, and general funding purposes, what the state tends to do sometimes is actually forecast a budget based on current market conditions for the price per barrel on oil, instead of being a little bit more conservative and lowering that just in case we have a bust or a boom, that we can appropriate funds specifically with the amount of cash we actually will have in our coffers at the end of the day. But I appreciate this, but I think this conversation, but I think we have to be mindful, and it's been stated over and over, the amount of emissions that we're talking about, the way this changes the emissions globally is so minute. To put these kind of jobs at risk, to put lower income earners at risk of not being able to afford energy. My question to Mr. Goodrick, just finishing up here, would be, how can we be sure that if we're looking at a global clean energy future, who's going to hold China, Russia accountable? Because we know right now they are not held to the same standards as our producers.
Thank you, Representative, for the question. I mean, and I know I have very limited time. What's interesting here is that the Rhodium Group did an analysis of carbon reciprocity. In other words, reductions from the United States, do they lead to reductions elsewhere? And the Rhodium Group found that for every metric ton of climate pollution that the United States reduces, it results in 6 metric tons of reductions globally. In other words, the United States can lead on global emissions reductions, and that sparks emissions reductions around the world. That's how we hold China accountable.
Great. Thank you. And Mr. Chair, I'm out of time, so I yield back. Thank you. Thank you, witnesses.
Thank you, Representative Harrell. I now recognize Representative DeGette for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and thanks to the witnesses. I appreciate all of your testimony, and I will just point out to my colleague from New Mexico is that it's one thing making sure that all of our witnesses submit all of their qualifications and their potential conflicts, and it's another thing attacking witnesses. I agree we shouldn't attack witnesses, but I think probing their potential conflicts of interest is completely appropriate. As chair of the Oversight and Investigation Subcommittee of Energy and Commerce, I think that that's a critical issue. But what I really want to do is talk about methane, because that's an issue that I've been working on for many, many years. And Senator Hamlin, I really want to thank you as your neighbor to the north. I want to thank you for joining us today. Earlier in the hearing, you talked about the cloud of methane over New Mexico, but yet some of our colleagues keep talking about all the progress that the oil and gas industry has made in reducing emissions, making it sound like that's enough. So I want to ask you, when you talk about the methane cloud over New Mexico, do you think there is room for improvement?
Absolutely, Representative. Thank you so much for the question. I do think there's opportunities for improvement. I think, we can move toward renewable energy, which will reduce the methane emissions. We can move towards diversifying our economy and revenue streams, which will reduce the emissions when we start looking at like outdoor recreation, as I've mentioned before. There's a young queer, two-spirited indigenous climate activist by the name of Jonathan Juarez Alonso. He just wrote about, we're talking about climate change today and how it impacts New Mexico. New Mexico's drought has been the driest 20-year period since the late 1500s and the second driest since 800 CE, and we are in the midst of a mega drought. When we talk about like the multiple earthquakes that are happening earlier this fall in West Texas, they're now starting to trickle over into New Mexico because of fracking. We really have to look at the opportunities. As I've said, we're running out of time.
Yeah.
We do have to look at these opportunities to change.
And there are ways that industry can reduce methane emissions even more. And we've got legislation in Congress to do that. Ms. Begay, can you speak to the impacts of methane pollution from oil and gas infrastructure on our local communities and why it's so important that the federal government clamps down on this pollution? You need to unmute.
You need to unmute.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay,
You're
can
unmuted.
you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay, thank you. And I believe Senator Hamblin has detailed on this question. What I want to focus on is what steps New Mexico can take to break the dependency on oil and gas. So yes, we are an energy state, but to me, this means that there's a lot of potential here to lead in the right direction and to be leaders in a just transition. I'm grateful to Governor Lujan Grisham for joining the U.S. Climate Alliance and also putting into law the Energy Transition Act, which has a goal of being carbon zero by 2050. But really, if we open these leases next year, I don't see how we'll meet those goals. So when it comes to next steps, I think instead of more investment of time and resources going into oil and gas, we need to be planning the just transition right now and building plans to implement the civilian climate corps in our regions, because we all know this can't happen overnight. That would be unjust. So in this moment, when we know we need to be investing in renewables 6 times more than what we currently are, and that was actually a statement from the U.S. Special Envoy on Climate. We need to be having the conversations and taking action to make sure that as we transition away from this industry, that we are building pathways for jobs, that we have community buy-in, and that we have community trust, really, and to understand this pathway forward.
And you keep talking about justice. You're a member of the White House Environmental Justice Advisory Committee. I think you probably agree with me. Methane waste prevention is an environmental justice issue. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely, 100%.
Senator, you're nodding your head. You would agree too. Thank you so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you, Representative DeGette. I now recognize Representative Tiffany for 5 minutes of questions. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Do you have me?
Yes, you're ready.
Okay, terrific. So I'm really happy to hear that a man from Wisconsin, Aldo Leopold, is being quoted frequently in this subcommittee hearing. And I would just share this. One of what I think Leopold's greatest statements was, those wild things have very little value if a man does not have a good breakfast. And it really spoke to conservation. I thought that was one of his greatest statements. But anyhow, I have a question for Ms. Begay. Ms. Begay, I understand that you went to Glasgow for COP26. Congratulations on making it over there. How many private jets came into Glasgow during that conference?
Private jets, I am not sure. I think I could look into that more. I did not fly on a private jet.
Yeah, if you get that answer, that'd be terrific. Would love to hear it. How much did China promise at COP26 to reduce their emissions, and by what year did they make a commitment to reduce their emissions?
I'm actually not quite sure on those numbers. That's another thing I can follow up on, Congressman.
Yeah, that'd be terrific. My understanding is that China anyone there. They had some people there, but not a person who was a decision maker. And that also they put off until like 2070 before they will commit to any emission reductions. And as we've heard regularly through this hearing, it is China that's driving this at this point. And while America gets better and better, China does not. And if we're going to unilaterally disarm, then we should be prepared to give up our role as the leading country in the on this earth to being the world's global superpower, pushing out our values of freedom and opportunity. The final thing I would say, Ms. Begay, is that this is not a question, but I understand your disillusionment with the Biden administration, as you said in your testimony, and people across America are sharing that disillusionment at this point. So, Mr. Loris, what impact will an export ban have on emissions globally?
Yeah, that's a great question. There's been some analysis that it could reduce emissions, though there's also those analyses are not taking into consideration that any decrease in domestic production could largely be met by OPEC plus, and therefore, because of all of the inefficiencies created by bringing back the export ban, that could create a number of different problems with supply chains, with matching crude oil to the refineries that are best equipped to handle refining the different types of crude oil, that all of those inefficiencies created by restricting the sale and export of crude oil could result not only in higher gas prices, but higher emissions.
You know, when you bring that up in regards to refineries, I find that very interesting. Isn't it time that America build a few new refineries that accept this cleaner crude oil, this lighter crude oil that we have, that has come on as a result of the fracking revolution?
Yeah, I think it's a combination of building more refineries to handle those, because before the fracking revolution, the Gulf Coast made $100 billion investment, not knowing that the fracking revolution was going to happen, to handle the heavier sour crudes coming from Canada, coming from the Middle East. And so they're equipped to handle some of these light sweeter crudes, but it doesn't make the most economic sense to do so. And so I think, the more we can expand that refining capacity when it makes economic sense to do so, places near the Permian, places in North Dakota, and even some of those refineries in the Northeast, the more of that manufacturing and refining capacity will benefit those in the United States.
Who's going to fill those international markets if we shut off export of crude and oil products? Who's going to fill those markets, and will they put out more emissions than the United States or less?
Yeah, it's going to be OPEC plus. It's going to be Saudi Arabia. It's going to be Russia. It's going to be Iran and Iraq. It's going to be Nigeria. And any country that I listed, I'm pretty confident doesn't have as rigorous as environmental standards as those here in the United States. And because oil is so ubiquitous in the economy, and because near-term changes in prices don't change behavior on the consumption side, that increase in production, as we've seen, countries that have ramped up production faster than in the United States were places like Saudi Arabia and Russia.
So we oftentimes hear these anecdotes about climate change is happening and it's a crisis and all the rest. And here's this anecdote. I want to share an anecdote with this committee. That is, I don't know if you saw recently, but there's 13 Russian ships that are currently iced in the Arctic, where we have heard that the ice caps are melting and all that good stuff. Well, the Russians got a real problem right now because they've got a whole lot more ice. So I would throw that into the anecdotal pile. I mean, let's go back to the mid-1970s when Time and Newsweek did their front covers that the world was going to be was going to freeze to death by 2000. We were not going to have enough crops. Paul Ehrlich, one of the leading doomsayers in the history of mankind, was telling this story of gloom and doom. It did not happen. And now we're making all these decisions based on models rather than facts. And we can model this stuff out all we want. But as we heard earlier, America unilaterally disarming in regards to energy independence will lead to our decline. Americans are winners. I urge everybody to take a step back and say, let's make sure America stays energy independent. That way we achieve economic independence, we have far more jobs, and we also protect our national security. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Representative Tiffany. I now recognize Representative Huffman for his questions.
Good morning, and thank you, Mr. Chair. During this holiday season, I suppose it's no surprise to hear our Republican colleagues talking a lot about their holiest trinity. Of course, I'm talking about oil, gas, and coal. It is no surprise because they always talk about fossil fuels. I've never seen any situation where their answer wasn't drill, baby, drill. And when your only tool is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. Mr. Chairman, this hearing is timely, coming on the heels of the Interior Department's report recently on the federal oil and gas leasing program. It's a report that frankly is lacking in its climate outlook, but at least it outlines some common sense ways to fiscally reform oil and gas operations on our public lands to ensure American taxpayers get a fair shake. And that includes finally increasing royalty rates, minimum bids, bonding levels, and more. Now, predictably, our Republican colleagues are claiming that even these baby steps towards ending fossil fuel subsidies on our federal lands would be catastrophic. Even though gas prices always rise and fall, even though big oil always gouges consumers when it ever has a chance, even though gas prices are actually starting to fall now, they warn that these reforms would hurt consumers at the pump. Now, the North American supply analyst at S&P Global Platts Analytic disagrees. He says, and I'll quote, "Nothing in this report would tangibly impact near or medium-term supply from the U.S. if enacted." So, Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich, I just want to ask you if you agree. Do you think implementing these fiscal reforms would cause gas prices to surge?
No, absolutely not, Representative. In fact, what these fiscal reforms would do is just ensure that American taxpayers are getting a fair return on the investment. The reality with production is that it's driven by supply, and it's driven by price, and price is driven by global markets. I found it interesting in thinking about energy independence and, for example, the export ban. When we lifted the export ban, what we did was we hitched ourselves to the wagon of global energy markets. So rather than U.S. domestic oil supply being used to serve U.S. domestic interests, which would achieve true energy independence, we essentially threw it out on the market, and then we became beholden or more beholden to, say, oil markets being driven by OPEC or by Russia overall. So when you think about just getting a fair return on investment, that's all we're trying to do here with the administration's reforms.
Thank you. Now, the Republican answer to the fossil fuel price gouging roller coaster is, of course, to develop and export even more fossil fuel, as if there's no climate crisis, as if pollution and the myriad spills, explosions, disruptions, and disasters that are intrinsic to this industry just don't matter, as if continuing to ride this same dysfunctional roller coaster we've been on for the past century will somehow make it better. Why would we choose this dysfunctional roller coaster, especially as our planet melts down from carbon pollution, if there is a better option within our reach? And Mr. Schlenker-Goodrich, I'm wondering if you see some opportunities to get off this roller coaster. Of course, in the short term, there's already been discussion about suspending the export ban. But over the longer term, how about giving consumers an alternative to the tyranny at the pump? Rapidly electrifying the transportation sector, subsidizing electric vehicles instead of fossil fuel development. How would that help protect consumers from high gas prices?
Yeah, absolutely. It's interesting that electric vehicles have now surpassed 10% of the global auto market. So we're seeing this S curve where EVs are accelerating rapidly. the world is decarbonizing. And so the notion that there will be just more oil and gas production does not meet the reality that the world is decarbonizing and moving away from oil. Your metaphor of a roller coaster is apt. Yesterday, Senator George Munoz, the chairman of New Mexico's Senate Finance Committee, said in the Albuquerque Journal, "I recognize the importance of oil and gas in New Mexico, but I also recognize as an appropriator, we can't ride the roller coaster." So as we decarbonize, as we get off oil, we allow ourselves in the United States to be leaders on the climate transition.
Appreciate that. So we've seen what happens when you combine extreme reliance on fossil fuel and extreme deregulation. That is the Republican energy policy. We saw it when poorly regulated fossil fuel infrastructure failed and the Texas grid shut down a few months back. We see it whenever there's a war somewhere around the world or some market manipulation by OPEC or any time big oil sees a chance to gouge consumers. We see it all the time. And of course, we see it in the melting down of our planet from carbon pollution. But those of us who actually make the switch to EVs, which we've been talking about, we're not only helping end that carbon pollution, we are ending the wild price gyrations and the price gouging adventures we always see with gasoline. Because through all of those disruptive fossil fuel events, the sun keeps shining, the wind keeps blowing, and our cars keep charging. Now, I'll just close by addressing the frequent false choice we hear from our Republican colleagues, that we have to keep the world hooked on American fossil fuel or else everyone will just buy Russian fossil fuel. Let me just say, Vladimir Putin's worst nightmare is a world that doesn't need all that oil and gas, a world where every country's energy and transportation needs are met from affordable, reliable, renewable sources within their own borders. We can make that happen. We should make that happen, not just to address the climate crisis, but to bring more stability and prosperity to the world. So thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Huffman. I now recognize Representative Stansbury first to the committee and for 5 minutes of questions.
Thank you, Chairman Lowenthal, and thank you for the opportunity to join you all today. It's such a pleasure to see so many New Mexicans here today, many friends and colleagues and folks who I've actually worked with on climate for many years. So really, thank you so much for being here today and for inviting me to be a part of this subcommittee hearing. So, we've heard a lot today about what's happening with our energy economy, and New Mexico is an oil and gas state. It's also a science and technology state, and it is a climate action state. And I want to say that I am so proud that our governor has been at the forefront of helping to address climate change. As was mentioned, she was in Glasgow the last couple of weeks ago to announce our state's big announcements on climate action. And it was one of her first actions upon taking office as the governor. Was her third executive order was to sign a climate action order. So our state has managed to both walk the tightrope of being an energy producing state, as well as being one of the forefront and leading states in climate action. But I think it's important to really talk about how the oil and gas industry operates and how that ties into the local economies as well as the state budget of New Mexico. And I know there's been a lot of discussion about that, but there's also been a lot of misinformation shared today in this hearing. And so I want to kind of correct some of that. So New Mexico is home to 2 large oil and gas basins and some other smaller ones, but the San Juan Basin up in the north side of the state and the Permian Basin, which we share with Texas. And the first thing that I really want to say is that oil is booming right now. There's been a lot of things said today, and I hear this in energy hearings a lot, that somehow American competitiveness has been compromised by climate policies, and that is just false. That is patently false and untrue. Our oil and gas production is driven largely by global commodity prices. So in New Mexico, as has been discussed, as the price of oil goes high, production goes up, our revenues go up, we collect those revenues, there's more profits coming into industry, and production goes up. When prices go low, or in the cases they did last year, production goes down, wells get shut down, development of wells goes down, and leases do not get developed. So the idea that somehow climate policies are driving production and that American competitiveness is suffering from our climate policies is not true. Our world is facing a global climate crisis. We are literally at a tipping point. The IPCC report that was released a few months ago basically told us that if we do not take action globally across every sector of our society on every continent of this planet to cut carbon emissions, we will cross a tipping point that will affect every community on this planet. So that means we have to address climate change on our public lands. We have to address climate change in all of our industries. We have to address it in our electricity sector, in our oil and gas sector. We have to address it in our transportation sector. We don't have a choice at this point because our planet is facing a global tipping point. And so that is why it's so crucial that we look at every possible option in order in the short term to address the crisis of emissions so that we do not cross that tipping point. We have to also address the impacts of climate change that we're already experiencing, drought, fires, and all the things that have been discussed here today. And we have to ensure the long-term economic security of our communities, and in a place like New Mexico that is so dependent on those revenues, that we diversify our economy so that our state is not on this endless roller coaster of not being able to control its own destiny. We have to do all three of those things. We can't pick or choose because the crisis is already here. So addressing the emissions, especially from oil and gas, and putting our state on the path to a just transition is crucial not only to our planet and doing our part as a climate action state, but also to the security and the well-being and the justice and the equity and the sustainability of our local communities. Because our communities are dependent on those jobs. Our communities are dependent on that local economic development, and our state is dependent on those revenues. So with that, I know we've already had a lot of discussion this morning about this in this hearing, but I'd love to hear from Senator Hamblin a bit more. I know you are working on this not only in your professional life, but also as a state legislator. Can you please talk to us some more, both how do you see the long-term diversification of our economy? What are the major sectors that we can be moving in? And then how do we ground that work in really community-based economic development so that we're empowering communities to control their own destinies and their own futures as they're imagining new local economies?
Absolutely. Thank you, Representative. It's good to see your face on here today, and thank you for the work that you're doing on behalf of New Mexico. And I've mentioned this before in terms of diversifying our economy, and we have these opportunities. We've talked about outdoor recreation. We've talked about creating new industries. And one of the things that I've been talking about specifically is really moving more toward renewable energy and providing opportunities for New Mexicans who are working in the oil fields, who have worked on the oil and gas, who've done this for decades. That they have jobs that make either equal to or more than what they're making right now. And I think that's our responsibility as legislators to make sure that those industries exist, that they are created, and that there are no obstacles to make sure that we do that. But I also feel that it's really important, as you and I both know, how rural New Mexico is and how we have populations that are getting ignored in this conversation about climate change and about diversifying our economy and about making sure that our rural communities thrive. And so I feel that it's really important that we focus those new industries in those communities so that they can flourish just as much as Albuquerque or Las Cruces or Santa Fe. And so I think that that's really where we have to have those conversations to make sure that we're doing that and make sure that those communities have a voice in that conversation.
Thank you, Senator. And I know I'm out of time, but I just want to say, this is such a vital conversation. It's about ensuring the long-term security of our communities. And actually, this is why we are fighting to pass the Build Back Better Act here in Congress, so that we can infuse our communities with money and resources and the infrastructure bill that we just passed, so that we can do that economic diversification and invest in our communities and their future. So I want to thank all of our witnesses, and thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the time, and I yield back.
Thank you, Representative Stansbury. And I want to thank all the witnesses for their valuable testimony and the members for their questions. And I also want to comment and thank the witnesses and especially the members for the respectful tone that they've conducted themselves in this meeting. It is very appreciative, as by the chair, but as we try to deal with some very complex issues. The members of the committee may have some additional questions for the witnesses, and will ask for you to respond to these in writing. Under Committee Rule 3.0, members of the committee must submit witness questions within 3 business days following the hearing. And the hearing record will be held open for 10 business days for these responses. If there's no further business, without objection, this committee stands adjourned.